So in many ways, I've learned my lesson that I really should stop trying to aim toward readathons because I'm just a horrendous person at following TBRs or anything of that like. But I did read 15 books, so I'm excited about that. I think I'm going to talk about these in genre. So first of all, I'm going to start with nonfiction. So the first one that I read was Femina, and this is by Janina Ramirez. I liked it, but I didn't love it. I found it really interesting because it traced the Middle Ages, and it kind of, the tagline is telling the Middle Ages about the women who were not spoken about, women who were written out of history. Because we're going so far back in history, a lot of these women are, one of the most primary characters is this person that received a burial on a bed, which is a more pagan kind of tradition, but she also had crosses and stuff like that. So it's showing the integration of Christianity and of the Celtic kind of world of Britain. And this is very, very Britain focused, which I kind of hate, considering if you know anything about history, you know that like a lot of the stuff that was going on in the quote unquote dark ages was happening on the more eastern side of the world. So to focus so much on Britain it feels very, Britain central, because yeah, I love Britain. It's interesting, all of those things. Like I don't mind learning about Britain, but it's not said to be a medieval history of Britain or Europe because there's no primary characters throughout all of this that focus on anywhere outside of Europe. We talk about how, they turned up like bones and they figured out that this bones was someone who was from African descent, but like that's not looking at what's going on in like any African country during this era. It's not looking at what's happening in China. I thought it was too limited in scope. The next book that I read that was nonfiction, I also had interesting thoughts about, and this is super infinite, the Many Transformations of John Donne by Catherine Rendell. I first became interested in this book because of the like wonderful ways in which the author talked about it. I just found her talking about John Donne so interesting. And if you'd asked me place John Donne in history, I would have put him, early Victorian, Regency, maybe Georgian era. But no, he's a contemporary of Shakespeare. He might or might not have known Shakespeare. He might have even published with Shakespeare, but we don't know because the records are really small in some areas. Born into a Catholic family during the era of Queen Elizabeth, and then he lives in this family and his brother is exiled, and he goes from being like this very outwardly like, man around town with like a hat and like all of those things, and he's Jack Donne, to being like a very strong preacher in his more elderly age. But it's such interesting to see the development, and that's something that she looks at throughout a lot, like how does someone change throughout their life and what changes them. And I have to say that his poetry doesn't really work for me, at least the poetry experts that she said. I'm listening to an audio again, so like that might be some of the differences, like, but I really like Shakespeare, so it's not like the style. I just think that him being more metaphysical and stuff like that does kind of make me go, no. Catherine Rendell really loved him as a person, and I don't think that I can share that joy. So like when someone is so over the moon about this man and like about his charm and about like how much he captures people, and I'm like, I don't get the appeal, it really makes it harder to connect with the material. And I don't think that that is like at all something that should be actually a real criticism, because like you should be obsessed with a person that you want to write a biography about. Like that's a good thing, but I just couldn't get into the vibe of it. Continue on there, I did still want to read another biography. So I read the one on Agatha Christie by Lucy Worsley, and Lucy Worsley is just like that staple. Like I don't even know where I first saw her, but like, she's a staple of this British lady talking about cool things. And I've listened to a few of her documentaries and stuff, and I've had Jane Austen at home on my shelf for a really long time, and spoiler alert, right after I finished this, I started it. It will be my June wrap up, but I'm really enjoying it. And this one I enjoyed as well. I've known a fair bit more about Agatha Christie than I have about the previous people, and I really enjoyed looking at her life. I especially liked that it looked at both her and her daughter and her family and the ways in which those coexisted. Like Catherine Rendell, she really highlighted the aspects of what Agatha Christie changed, because she was born in 1890, a Victorian childhood, and lived that for the first 11 years of her life. Then she came of age in the Edwardian age, and she had older siblings, and like a lot of maternal people in her life came of age right at the time when World War I broke out and modernity kind of struck on. And like, even though she married her husband in 1914, she didn't live with him for the first 5 years of her marriage because, war. And then you go into the 1920s about her becoming an author, the ways in which women are viewed, her becoming a pariah in the times in which her husband has an affair and like she runs away, and like this kind of cruel, maligned view. And that's really interesting because it really holds the dice on that of whether people think she's like a manipulative kind of cold woman or if she's like an elderly grandma. And there's nothing in between that. But I find her really interesting. And, you know, she is more conservative in some aspects and doesn't identify with feminism. And yet she does the actions of a feminist is something that Lucy Worsley highlights because her characters do often look at social changes and include a more diverse character. Although she does not shy away from showing the ways in which she can be anti-Semitic and the ways in which, you know, And Then There Was None has a lot of racial components on it. It's a very fair biography that both looks at her faults and looks at her heights. And I do think that Lucy Worsley is a quite neutral biographer. And it feels like Femina and Super Infant both feel very person-central, like a love of that or a hatred of that really ingested in this, and this doesn't. And I said that in those parts sometimes bothered me. In this part, it did feel more mild because of that. And I think because Agatha Christie and Jane Austen are both characters that I do really love, I would have been more okay with that like ebullient love. I find it really interesting and I learned a lot about her life. I definitely didn't know about her being a nurse in both world wars, about the ways in which like her family really lost its wealth. So she went from having like all these houses to, you know, in World War II when her grandson was born, being like a nurse and taking care, like going back and forth between that and like also working as a cook and like learning all of those things. And it's really cool to learn about her story and to learn about all of the things in which she did. The last nonfiction book that I will briefly mention, because I've been talking way too much, will be On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder. This is a book I originally read in 2018 and it was a 5-star. And I think I lowered it to 3 or 4, somewhere in there. I definitely enjoyed it, but you can definitely tell that it comes out right after Trump is elected. And some of the things that I agree with are still there, but they feel different, you know, they feel like a reaction to something that just happened versus like we live that reality and are still living on the rise of the right wing so strongly that like it does really paint things slightly differently. It feels less evocative, it feels less fresh than it did to me in like early 2018 than it does now, like 5-6 years later. So yeah, I still think that it's like a good introductory book. I think a lot of other books more finely point out the ways in which like systematic and tyranny and all of that goes on. And then if we're going to go into some literary fiction, general fiction, I read Demon Copperhead. I have an entire review about it, so I won't really talk about it a lot. I don't have the flying colors that a lot of people like here. I think that it's an okay novel. I think that I understand some of the appeal, but I do think that many authors more poignantly and more nuancedly talk about the same issues in which Barbara Kingsolver was trying to do here. And then I read The Swimmers, which was the opposite effect. I really, really love this book. I have an entire review just gushing and like reading chapters. This was another book that some people thought was going to win the Pulitzer Prize, and I would have been okay with that. It looks at this one woman's descent into dementia and the different areas of her life, and it is so wonderfully written. And the style of Julie Otsuka's writing is really marvelous, and it's one that I've been playing with ever since because it's like entranced me in such a cool way. And then I have Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri, and this was a really interesting novel because I read her short stories Whereabouts, and I loved both of these books. I felt more mid about this. I think that it definitely fits into that like early 2000s kind of style in a way that I don't always love. I don't really know how I feel about The Namesake because there are some aspects that I really, really loved and some that were really painful and that made me cry. But I have to say that I still felt slightly removed from Gokul. Whenever we saw the other characters, like his father or his mother, or even his girlfriend, like I really get like enmeshed with their stories. But Gokul I never really fully felt with, and he's like what we spent probably 98% of the book with. And I think that it is because he's like a dude in this era. Namesake is set from the 1960s all the way to the 2000s and is kind of looking at this boy's life and this family's life of being first generation and second generation Indian immigrants, and it is really evocative of the ways in which life changes and the ways in which we become disentangled and re-entangled with culture. And I feel like I struggled because Gokul kind of hates his culture and is disrespectful to his parents in many places, and just in ways that like really frustrated me because we start with his parents and we see their hopes and their desires for him, and then we see him like not really care. And The Emperor Was Divine, and this is another Julie Asuka's novel because I really just wanted to read something more by her, and this is her first novel. It is set during World War II and deals with Japanese internment, which is history in her family as well. And I found this book really impressive. I think that like her interesting and narrative form is still kind of in its infancy stages. Like the ways in which she manages different forms and narration and tone is like so wonderful in The Swimmers, and this is published like 20 years before, so like it's not quite as refined, but it's still there and it's still quite well done. And we look at the different points of view from many different family points, and we still have like individual and then also we point of views looking at, you know, this mother and these children who are interned and separated from their family and separated from their father, and what it felt like to be a Japanese American who was in prison for the state of their ancestry and nothing else. And then my next genre that I read was fantasy, and I was really happy about this because fantasy is a genre that I used to read a lot of and I've read a lot less of in the last few years. The first one is a horror book, but I'm going to put it in this section because it fits better here than anything else. And it was really interesting because I read Jawbone at the same time that I read The Swimmers, and both of them deal with motherhood in such an interesting way. This is a very like high trigger warning book, so like if you have sensitivities to things, like I would definitely check out reviews and stuff like that before you dive in. It is set in Ecuador and it deals with this teacher as well as these students. And it is like creepy and daunting in like the way that just feels like it's unfurling under your skin. Like I really loved it. Like the daughter who is the teacher really wants to be like her dead mother, to the point where like she's upset that her mother's like undergarments are too big for her because she wants to wear them but they'll fall down, so she'll only wear them while sleeping, and like she's trying to like do her jaw and like everything else the exact same. There are some areas where I feel like this can fall a little bit into ableism because there's like a kind of reverence for like Frida Kahlo and the ways in which she had to back things, and some of the ways that that is described I don't love. And I think that, you know, disability is often used really negatively in horror, and I don't think that it fully goes over the line, but many comments just kind of made me go, no. It is really unsettling in the ways that this is dealt with. And then the schoolgirls are like, you know, they're kind of on this precipice of like wanting to explore sexuality, wanting to explore what it means to be a girl and all of these things, but they're still like kind of held back. And then there's like a lot of like, you know, them testing the limits of the things, and then peer pressure and these dares and these stories of folklore and of witches and all of these things. And parts of it are really creepy and parts of it made me like actively uncomfortable because of some of the places where it went. The ways in which these combine are interesting because you see radically different points of views and you sympathize with radically different people depending on who is narrating. And I liked the book overall. The ending was abrupt to the point where like sometimes like I don't like horror because it over explains, or, you know, it's like Pet Sematary, where I love Pet Sematary until like the 80% mark, and then it's like, let's up the tension, or The Shining as well. Let's up the tension of having like this really demonic force, and then you're like, no, it doesn't really work. And that doesn't do that because it cuts off before like the final climax. So it feels like there's a little bit missing. Like I didn't need a full explanation of what was going on, but I felt like I got nothing. I'm reminded of some ways of why I don't read horror, but I also found it really interesting thematically. The next book that I read was The Adventures of Amina al-Safiri, and I really loved this. It is about a woman in her late 30s who was a pirate lord back in the day, and then she went into kind of her country home way up in like these rickety mountains that no one can see because there is ransoms out for her and she wants to raise her daughter in peace. And it is a really, really good book about this woman who many people, you know, discount. And like, again, late 30s isn't middle-aged, despite the fact that she's called middle-aged throughout the novel. And I'm like, that's not middle-aged. But yeah, you really see the point of view of this woman and the different ways. And I really just love Chakrabarty's like writing and the way in which she holds stories so interesting. I really enjoyed her David Bad series, which is the next book that I read, and this is River of Silver, which is the companion piece and kind of short stories that begin before and go all the way into and then around, and it begins with a little paragraph explaining where it is in the story and also if it has spoilers for the different books. And a lot of them do, but I just really enjoyed it because it shows how delicate she is with her stories, because many of these she kind of talks about how she wrote them because she needed to write a scene, or she needed to write from a point of view of a character that would have been spoiler or would have revealed too much, or just, you know, wasn't needed for the story, but she needed to understand the character better, so she wrote these. And then during the time in which like COVID was hitting and a pregnancy and all of these things, like she was trying to work on Amina and she just couldn't, so then she returned to these, and I I really enjoy both of these books so much, and they made me want to go back and read the David Bed series because it has become one of my favorites. After I read River of Silver, I thought that I should probably read like another companion piece because, you know, I'm on a roll, and I read Last Violent Call, which is a book that sits between Chloe Gaughan's two series and connects them in some ways. And this felt less purposeful than River of Silver, and I think it might have suffered for that connection. I always really hate that there's so much belittling of romance because I feel like I can't critique something that is primarily like romantic central without feeling like I'm adding to that criticism that it's not substantial. Because I do think that romance is really, really important, and fun romance, not just tragic romance. And I love these characters together and I enjoyed them. But I do think that they came off unrealistic with their amount of sappiness. I have two brothers who have been happily married both for like over 5 years, and both of them have known their wives for 10 to 15 years. Like both of them married like really good friends of theirs and had like delightful friends to lovers romances that I just got to see and love so much. And like both of them are still madly in love with their wives, and I see them interact in ways that like, you know, they can be sappy in some ways. They'll still kiss in front of me all the time, even though they have kids and stuff like that. And that's just part of the ways in which they show romance. So like, I'm not against people who have been in long-term relationships, like being affectionate and being in love and like wanting to be around each other. Just the way that it came off felt very much like the way in which new lovers come off. I love my Jake and Amy, like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, like establish they're not going to break up, they're going to have a solid relationship, and they're not going to like fight about big things really. Like sometimes they do, but in most times they like, you know, have arguments about like who's going to move in with who, and it's like, you know, a bet and stuff, but they realize like the importance. And like that's the thing, is like I wish there would be more like just lived in jesting and trial rather than like I'm obsessed with you kind of things, if that makes sense. I don't know how to explain this fully, but like there was something a little bit off on the way in which like a long-term romance, it's meant to be fun, it's meant to be connecting, it does connect lightly to the plot of Foul Lady Fortune. There was an ode to Agatha Christie in here as well that I liked. I read Bloodmarked by Tracy Deonn, and this was the second book in the Legendborn series, which combines like Arthurian legend into the real world of America and its legacy of race and its legacy of slavery and the ways that it has built itself up on the oppression of other people. And this comes into the fold with the main character being a Black girl and her experience of what it means to be a part of legends and be part of these societies. One of the things that has always stuck with me from the first book is when they're kind of doing therapy in a graveyard and they say like, I don't want to be stepping on people's graves, and the therapist goes like, you're always going to be stepping on graves. Like America and like lots of these countries are always built on the backs of Black people and of their suffering, and we see that really evidently, and the complicatedness of taking up a role from like a really dominantly white society when also remaining to yourself. And it's really interesting. The second book I thought was the third book. Like I thought it was a duology rather than a trilogy. It was super long. Like I feel like it could have been edited down a lot, but like I did really enjoy the stories and some of the questions and conversations and some of the shipping going on. I love a good romance. And then I finished The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I liked this book a lot. I read it with my nephew from like February to May, so like it was a long process, bedtime readings and all of those things. But I really enjoyed getting into this world, and I've now started a little bit of The Lord of the Rings with him, and I'm just really excited to get into Fellowship of the Ring and all of that. I feel like it's going to be great. I think that he has a really interesting style, and I understand why he's had the groundwork of fantasy. I still think it's not like necessarily the fantasy that I enjoy. I love a more like intersectional fantasy, more political fantasy rather than like adventure fantasy. And then last but certainly not least on my books, I have The Mysteries of Thorn Manor, and this is by Margaret Rogerson and is a sequel to her book Sorcery of Thorns. And this is like a small novella that isn't as much obsessed with the plot and more obsessed with like an aftermark, but again does a really good job of showing the dynamics of the characters, continuing the world and building it in such a fascinating way. And I was worried that this book wouldn't hold up because like I read that other book so long ago, and it really, really does. It deals with like magic books and the ways in which like a world is alive. Like if you love Harry Potter or something like that and you grow up and you want to have like a less problematic universe to jump into, like I would super recommend this one. Like it's fae inspired and it has like magic around every corner, and like it just makes you smile with such joy when also dealing with like great characters and dynamics and all of those things. And I just really loved like the melancholy, the romance, the world, and all of these questions, and I had such a fun time reading it. This was just like a delightful month of like revisiting favorites and like revisiting authors and stuff that I just had such a great time reading. So yeah, let me know what you have been reading, what you enjoyed in May, if you have different thoughts on the books that I read, if you would recommend books based on my like of these, and like let me know some biographies that have like nice, interesting things, because I think I might be in a biography mood. I will see you next time.